2024 was a huge year for mixed martial arts, but what does 2025 have in store for us? I've put together a list of 8 things I would love to see in the coming year in MMA. I'm going to share them with you right here on the RDX Sports Podcast. Welcome everybody to the RDX Sports Podcast. My name's Simon Head. Hope you had a great holiday season and Happy New Year from all of us here at RDX Sports. 2024, as I just said, big year for mixed martial arts, and I'm really excited for what we might get down the line in 2025. Big fights, big events, the UFC potentially going on the road even more than we saw last year. So much to look forward to in what will hopefully be a packed 12 months for the sport of mixed martial arts. I've had a little think about the things I would love to see in the course of the next 12 months. Some of them are a little bit pie in the sky, perhaps. Some of them are a little bit fantasy fight booking based. Some of them are absolutely things that we should not just want to see, but should expect to see. I've mixed them all together. We've got a list of 8. We're going to run through them here on the show. I'd love to hear your opinions on what you would love to see. So stick them in the comments down below. Hit me up on the socials at Simon Head Sport across all platforms, and share with me what you would love to see in the coming year in mixed martial arts. As for what I'd like to see, I've got 8 things listed down here. Let's kick things off with the first item on our list. All right, the first item on the list is a pretty straightforward one. I want to see the UFC on the road over here in Europe a lot more in 2025. Pre-pandemic, the UFC were visiting Europe 3-4 times a year. We had 1 or 2 shows a year in the UK, but we also had shows in mainland Europe as well, and the sport really felt as international as it's ever been in terms of the UFC traveling the world, putting on shows in different parts of the world. I've been fortunate enough to travel Europe following a lot of those events. Hamburg, Germany, Zagreb, Croatia, Gdansk in Poland, Krakow in Poland, lots of different places. I'd love to see more of that in the coming year. Obviously, the UFC has been over to France. They see the hotbed that is French MMA. They have a load of French athletes on their roster. That seems like an absolute gimme for the coming year. We know that they're coming to London in March this year. I cannot wait for that. But let's see a few more. MMA is exploding in Germany. You only need to see what Octagon MMA are doing with their events. Absolutely packing events out. They packed out a football stadium last year in Frankfurt. 59,000 fans in a football stadium. Now, the UFC doesn't necessarily need to do that, but they could certainly fill a 10, 15, 20,000 indoor arena in Germany, whether they go back to Hamburg or whether they go back to Berlin. Oberhausen is one they've done in the past, but I think Hamburg or Berlin would be the most likely landing spots for a German show if they wanted to do one. But I'd love to see them back in Germany again. I'd love to see them head off to some of the other countries across Europe as well. What it also does is it gives the opportunity for European athletes to actually fight on their own time zone, fight closer to their own fan base. And what that really does is it builds them up, but it also spreads the word of the UFC as well. And obviously with the UFC, they're looking at their new TV deal coming up soon. Potentially could be looking at Netflix, which would take them hugely international in terms of the way that people can consume their product. But to have fighters fighting in their native countries, and European MMA is as strong as it has ever been, to have the UFC on the road in 2025 would be fantastic for the sport on this side of the pond, and would really help elevate that talent and show the world that European MMA is right up there with the very best. We know that Russian MMA, particularly from that Dagestan region, can produce some of the world's greatest fighters. We know we've had some great fighters coming out of the UK. France have legalized the sport, and they've got some real athletic talent coming through their ranks as well. We've got lots and lots of different pockets of fighters and talent in Europe. Let's leverage that. Let's see that. Let's see it on the big stage, fighting on local time zones as well. The UFC came over and did UFC 304 in Manchester. We had that in the middle of the night. Great for the US audience, I get that. but my goodness, it was an absolute slog for everybody here in the UK. How much better would that event have been if it had been held at UK prime time? Trust me, it would have been way better. The atmosphere in the building is always good for a UFC event, no matter when it's on. But you put it on during daytime hours rather than in the middle of the night, it would have just been a notch higher. So I'd love to see more of that. I know the UFC Fight Night show in London will be, thankfully, mercifully, at UK time. That will be fantastic. But let's see more European shows on the ground. I know Dana White has said that he wants to get on the road a little bit more, and Europe is that market where there's still some untapped markets. There, Spain is the big one, right? Get to Spain. Ilia Topuria headlining a card in Spain. Get Yoel Alvarez on that card as well. Let's get that Spanish talent on that card. Sign a few free agents. Pack it out with some Spanish talent on the lower prelim level. Get some European stars on that card. You could easily have a pay-per-view event or certainly a loaded fight night card in Spain. And if it was in the summer, who doesn't want to go and cover the UFC in Spain in the height of the summer? That just sounds like a dream assignment to me. So for a purely selfish standpoint, let's get that one booked. Let's do like a July event or an August event in Spain somewhere. Maybe go Barcelona, an event in Barcelona or an event in Madrid perhaps for the summer of 2025. That would be awesome. But for the UFC to come over and hold shows in Europe in 2025 would be great. European MMA, as I say, absolutely exploding right now. And it only makes sense with the UFC to get over there and make sure they're getting the largest slice of the pie possible. So that's my first one. UFC, let's get them over to Europe a bit more often in 2025. All right, the next one, we just talked about the UFC. Let's talk about the PFL. And the PFL are still developing, they're still growing. It feels like they're still sort of feeling their way in terms of establishing their own identity. And I know that they've already talked, Dom Davis has already talked about making tweaks and changes to the format for next season. Interested to see what that means. What I would love that to mean would be for it to be less league-based, where you've got regular season and playoffs. Just make it a tournament. Just make it a tournament, have brackets, have a draw, have fighters choosing who fights each other, and make their PFL tournament product a 1 year selected weight class tournament product, and just invest in the core product, which shouldn't be the tournament. It should just be getting your best fighters out there on regular fight cards. Whether you want to do it as a world tour where you have set stops around the globe, whether you do 12 live shows a year, one per month in different cities across the world, or whether you want to do more of a seasonal approach or more of an ad hoc approach like the UFC tends to do, where they're sort of booking through the year. However you want to do it, just leverage all the talent you have on your roster. It's been really sad to see that there's so much discontent among particularly some of the former Bellator fighters who are frustrated that they haven't got their chance to get in the cage and fight as frequently, or in some cases at all, in the last year or two. So the PFL have got so much talent on their roster, and really they've only scratched the surface of what they can do with it. So to be able to reposition themselves as a fight promotion in terms of how they're going to present themselves, having that league system, it gives them a point of difference, but it also is very restrictive in terms of how you can book fighters. And you've got this Bellator side project almost. It doesn't feel very interconnected. It's interesting. What the shows that look like they were the Bellator shows last year, it looks like the Bellator branding is on the way out, and they look to be branded as Road to Dubai. And the PFL Road to Dubai, I think, was the last one we saw advertised, which will be Usman Magomedov versus Paul Hughes. But I think what we need to do, if I'm running the PFL, which I'm not clearly, but if I was making any kind of decisions in terms of strategically for the PFL, have a more clearly defined product. At the moment, it's a piece here, a piece there. What they have done is built the infrastructure beneath the global level products, where you have regional leagues, and that league system works in that system because you're then building towards champions who you can then promote up to the global roster. That makes total sense. But it's what you do with the fighters when they're on the global level, because having that global tournament for the $1 million is all fine and dandy, but I think it should be just a tournament, and it should be selected weight classes. Shouldn't be across everything, because I think it massively restricts what you can do. Have set events. As I say, I would have a world tour. I would set a bit like the Formula One, where you have set Grand Prix dates in set places. You have your calendar laid out in front of you. If you want to go down the sports product route, if you like, they obviously wanted to align themselves more with sports leagues. They can tweak that a little bit. Maybe look at something like F1, where you've got, on this date, you have this Grand Prix in this location. You could do this with the PFL. You could have tournaments. You could have tournament running across the year, maybe 2, maybe 3 weight classes if you want, and you intersperse those fights in between the main PFL global product, if you like, and run that in set dates throughout the year. So you have 12 events or 10 events with 2 tournament dates in between, and then you have your tournament finals, and maybe have a night of champions kind of event where you crown your Grand Prix champions or your tournament champions, if you like. But you also load up with some of your super fight champions, if that's what you want to brand them as. But I think there's a lot of ambiguity over the different layers to the PFL. They have the amount of fighters that they need to be able to hold that number of events. They can start to trim the fat a little bit if they need to. But what's important is you have high quality fights. You have deep weight classes that allow you to make different matches, but you also have a cadence of events that means that fans know that this event's coming up next. That leads on to the next event, which is coming up here, then the next event that's coming up here, and it becomes appointment viewing. At the moment, it's a little bit disjointed. I would love to see things come together a little bit more for the PFL in 2025 and beyond. As I say, the regional stuff I think works. PFL Europe has been a success. I think the way that works, you only have to look at Dakota Ditcheva, the way that she came into that tournament, went through the tournament, became European champion, moved into the global tournament and became a champion there. It proves that stars can be built. If the talent is there, there's a pipeline to move it into the world level. It's what you do with the pinnacle of your product. And it feels like it's still very disjointed at the moment. So fingers crossed we see some improvements, we see some refinements from the PFL in 2025. Okay, the first 2 items on my wish list, if you like, I think pretty realistic. UFC coming to Europe, I think that's realistic. I think that's doable. PFL refining their products and making things a little bit better for themselves, I think that's realistic. I think it's sensible. Let's be a little bit less realistic. Let's be a little bit less sensible. Let's be a little bit ambitious and crazy and suggest something that almost certainly won't happen, but wouldn't it be amazing if it did? Let's have a tournament for the BMF title. Let's have a tournament for the BMF title. A Grand Prix. You know, like the old Pride Grand Prix where you had 3 events over the course of the year. I think it was critical countdown, final elimination, and then the final showdown event where the champion was eventually crowned. Let's do that for the BMF title. Now, these events don't need to be separate from the UFC calendar. You just put 1 or 2 of those fights from the tournament in selected pay-per-view events over the course of the year to build the tournament, and then you crown a BMF champion for the year at the end of the year, and maybe the last UFC pay-per-view event of 2025. My suggestion, just because of the depth of talent and because that's where the belt currently resides, let's have it in the lightweight division. Let's have an 8-man tournament in the lightweight division. And I've got a list here. Some of these fighters are featherweights who I would have move up for this tournament. Some of them are established lightweights. But imagine a tournament with Max Holloway, Alexander Volkanovski, Michael Chandler, Justin Gaethje, Dan Hooker, Rafael Fiziev, Drew Dober, Benoit Saint-Denis. I'll throw him in there. But perm 8 out of that list. And then put them in a draw to determine an order, and then get them picking the fights. Mick Main and Sean Shelby could just sit back and watch and enjoy while the fighters themselves pick their order K1 draw style. Once those fights are picked, you then schedule them to appear as maybe the opening main card fight, or the co-main event, or the third from the top fight on a main card on pay-per-view events throughout the course of 2025. Then you whittle the 8 down to 4, the 4 down to 2, and then the 2 fight in the finale at the end of the year. It means that the fighters in that absolutely stacked weight class at 155 pounds are in meaningful fights that aren't just about trying to work their way up to a fight against Islam Makhachev or Arman Sarukian. It means that the lightweight division carries even more relevance, carries even more cachet. It means that the fighters are in fights where, okay, the title itself isn't the only thing they can compete for. They're in this tournament for the BMF, and I think that would add an extra wrinkle. I think it's entirely unlikely that this would ever happen, but I'd love to see it. A tournament through the course of the year for the BMF title. This year, we do it at lightweight. Maybe the following year, we do it at middleweight. Or we then crown a female BMF at flyweight. And then you've got fighters from bantamweight who can maybe drop down. You've got fighters from strawweight who can maybe move up. And you do it at 125 pounds. This is something that the UFC could do. I don't know whether they would. It's unlikely that they would. But for someone who is a big fan of the tournaments, I would love to see it. So it's on my wish list. It's a more ambitious one, but we'll put it on there. A BMF tournament for 2025. All right, speaking of tournaments, and let's try and ground ourselves back down to some reality for a little bit. One area that the UFC does actually use tournaments is the Ultimate Fighter. And I know the Ultimate Fighter over the last 5-10 years, the luster has sort of worn off a little bit. The shine has kind of faded a little bit on the Ultimate Fighter, but it still has its uses, it still has its benefits, and it can, when done right, build a really big fight. It was supposed to build Michael Chandler versus Conor McGregor. Unfortunately, we know what happened there. But it made the season interesting. It made the season watchable because we were watching the dynamic between the two rival coaches. And I think what you need in the Ultimate Fighter is you need competition, you need rivalry, but you need personality as well. And for me, there are no two fighters more perfectly suited to coach opposite each other in the Ultimate Fighter than Renato Moicano and Paddy Pimblett. These two guys should absolutely be the next two coaches on the Ultimate Fighter. It'll be season 33 of the Ultimate Fighter. And these two guys would be absolutely tailor-made, not just for the Ultimate Fighter, but for a bout against each other. In terms of their standing in the lightweight division, they are close enough in the lightweight rankings that fight actually makes sense, even if you booked it now. Now, Moicano has a fight coming up. Paddy Pimblett, I think, is close to getting a fight booked. However, such is their personality, such is their standing within the lightweight division and their fan base on each side of the coin, that I think this is a fight that is bookable regardless of what happens in their respective upcoming matchups. This fight makes sense. And I think to put it on at the conclusion of the Ultimate Fighter with them coaching opposite each other would be incredible. The only argument against using these two guys is that they might look to use 2025 to see just how close these two guys can get to contendership at the very top of the division. And therefore, they want them in the rotation. They want to try and get 3 fights a year out of them to try and push them into championship contention, get some big pay-per-view fights out of the pair of them. However, the Ultimate Fighter is there. And I can't think of a better matchup in terms of the coaching, in terms of the personality, than Paddy Pimblett, Renato Moicano. They've both seemed pretty open to the idea. I think it's been mentioned by both of them before. And I think that they have the sort of charisma that I think the personalities would bounce off each other really well. I think there's certainly a rivalry that could be built between them, but I also think that the pair of them are respectful enough of each other that it won't go too far the other way. I think it on paper, it's the ideal matchup. It's the ideal coaching matchup. It's the ideal clash for a season of the Ultimate Fighter. Interested to see what happens with the Ultimate Fighter, especially with the TV deal set to change soon, how that might factor in, whether they look to repackage it, whether they look to rebrand it, whether they look to sell that separately to a broadcast partner. Who knows? All options are on the table. as the UFC look to work out their next move in terms of their broadcasting or distribution deals for the coming few years ahead. But for the Ultimate Fighter, assuming that it carries on in the format that it has been for the last few years, Renato Moicano and Paddy Pimblett is a slam dunk. Let's see it. Moicano, Pimblett, tough 33. Let's go. All right, everything we've talked about so far has been international, world level, UFC or PFL. Let's look at European mixed martial arts. It was a huge year in 2024 for Octagon MMA. I've been following their progress for the last few years, where big promotion locally in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, where they were born. That's where that promotion came out of. And then they started to sort of expand a little bit, see how far they could make inroads in the UK and how many inroads they could make in Germany. Didn't go that well in the UK. The brand didn't travel as well as perhaps they'd hoped. Didn't get the pickup from the UK fans that maybe they were hoping for, despite signing some real quality UK talent. The fan pickup for the events wasn't at the same level that we've seen in mainland Europe. They're packing out arenas and stadiums in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And now they're doing it in Germany as well. And what they've done in Germany is nothing short of huge. It's absolutely massive what they've done. They are playing full houses in big arenas. And now, following the event in Frankfurt, which I was fortunate enough to be at, where they played to a 59,000 seat football stadium, Eintracht Frankfurt Stadium, which has hosted World Cup matches, Champions League matches, European Championship matches. They played host to Octagon MMA, and that place was absolutely rocking on fight night. They're putting on events on a huge scale. The fights are high quality, well matched. The production is outstanding. And we talked about tournaments earlier. Their Tipsport Gamechanger tournament has been one of the biggest success stories in European MMA, I would say, over the last couple of years. It's been absolutely huge for them. It's elevated their product to a new level with the €1 million prize pot, €300,000 for the tournament winner. And it's really helped not just build the brand of Octagon MMA, it's also helped build their athletes as well and showcase their talent to a wider audience. And this coming year, 2025, they're going to be showcasing their middleweight division. We had a huge tournament last year, the lightweight division, which was won by Losine Keita, former lightweight champion, current featherweight champion, defeats Ronnie Paradiso, who was the defending lightweight champion going into that tournament. As a result, Keita is now a 2-division champion, and he's the Tipsport Gamechanger tournament champion for 2024. The man is an absolute star, one of the best fighters outside of the big global promotions, without doubt. Now we're looking at the middleweight division in 2025, and there's one space left in that tournament. They've named 15 out of the 16 spots. There's a wildcard spot just waiting to be filled. And the big question when that was first announced was, who's going to fill that spot? My initial thought was it'll be the former champion, Patrick Kinsella, who wasn't listed in the initial 15-man lineup for the middleweight tournament. Let's not forget, Patrick Kinsella just a year ago was the pound-for-pound number 1 in Octagon MMA, the all-conquering middleweight champion of the promotion. But he's taken some time away from the sport. He's resting and recuperating and assessing his next move. He lost his belt in Frankfurt in that stadium show to Kerim Engizek, who will probably be the number 1 seed in that Tipsport Gamechanger tournament this year. But with Kinsella currently out of the picture in terms of the tournament, there's a space there. There's a wildcard spot. And for me, there is really only one man who should be stepping into that spot. That man is Fleury. Fleury has had a huge year. He was basically bounced out of the PFL. He failed doping tests while he was in the PFL. Had to go back home. I think he was working as a labourer for a while, recuperating, setting himself up for potentially a final run at mixed martial arts, trying to really make himself a success at the highest level he possibly can. Signs with Octagon MMA, where there's a lot of talent and steps in there with a former K1 kickboxer in Daniel Scraw, submits him in 2 rounds in Birmingham, England. I was there for that. It was a great performance on his debut. That earned him a shot at the former interim champion, Pavel Langer, who is probably like MMA's closest equivalent to the Homer Simpson when he fought Mike Tyson in The Simpsons, where he just takes an insane amount of punishment and can then just turn around and finish you. Will Fleury did not stick around for that at all. Went in there, face plant, knocked out the guy in, I think it was like 80 seconds or something. Unbelievable performance in that football stadium in Frankfurt, and called out Carlos Vermola, who was the champion. That fight happened a few weeks ago. Will Fleury goes the distance with Carlos Vermola, but absolutely batters him from pillar to post over the full 5 rounds. Dominant victory. Will Fleury is now the light heavyweight champion of Octagon MMA. Now, he has options. He could fight Alexander Popek, the German contender, who's probably the best 205er in the division, not called Will Fleury. But there are a few other options available to him. And one of them, which I think was probably potentially the most lucrative, and certainly the one that would garner the most attention, would be for him to move back down to his old weight class of 185 pounds and compete in the Tipsport Gamechanger. There's a spare slot in that tournament, as I say, alongside Samuel Pirat Kristofic, who currently does not have an opponent in that tournament. That opponent could be Will Fleury. If Fleury beats Kristofic, all of a sudden, he's off and running at 185 pounds. And by the end of that tournament, he could potentially be almost like a triple crown champion. He's already the light heavyweight champion. He could potentially pick up the middleweight championship if that is on the line during the course of the tournament. And obviously, there's a tournament title itself. A huge opportunity for him. The big question is, having bulked up to get to 205 and now looking very comfortable and big at 205 pounds, can he move down to 185 pounds? Would he want to move down to 185 pounds and have to stay there for the course of a whole calendar year in order to compete in this tournament? Or does he want to stay at 205, defend his belt? Could he even move up to heavyweight? Could he potentially? Lazar Todev is for my money, he's the best heavyweight in Octagon MMA. He was due to fight Hatif Moel. He fought him actually a couple of years ago. I thought he beat him. Moel got the victory and was then declared the champion, captured the belt in that fight. Since then, Moel has been kicked out of the promotion and stripped of the title. He was due to fight Todev last year. That fight got scrapped after Moel went a bit crazy at the pre-fight press conference and did not take kindly to the sanctions that were going to be imposed on him. No showed for fight night, or basically said he wasn't turning up for fight night where he's due to headline and against Todev. So the belt lays vacant. Todev is basically a champion without a belt as far as I'm concerned. He needs an opponent. And Todev isn't the biggest heavyweight. So if Will Fleury wanted to put another 10, 15 pounds on, he could easily get in there with the likes of Lazar Todev at heavyweight. And that would be a very interesting fight as well. So Fleury, I think, has the ability to move up or move down or just stick where he is at 205 and look to establish himself there. Arguably, staying where he is probably the option with like the fewest eyeballs on it, if you like. I think potentially, unless he wants to go to Germany, go into Popek's backyard, fight Popek in his backyard and sort of play that heel character and be the bad guy in Germany, that certainly get him some attention. But nothing would get him more attention than to fight in that Tipsport Gamechanger tournament at 185 pounds. I would love to see it. If he can make the weight, if he wants to drop down, if he wants to lose a bit of that bulk, fight at 185 pounds, that would be one of the real stories to follow in 2025. So that's on my list of things I'd like to see in the coming year. Will Fleury in the Tipsport Gamechanger at 185 pounds. We talked about Will Fleury being a real success story in Octagon MMA. Someone else who has become a huge success story for their promotion is England's own Dakota Ditcheva. Came up through the PFL Europe pathway, became the PFL Europe Women's Flyweight Champion, just ran the table, brilliant performances, to capture that title and earn her spot in the global league for 2024. How would she do against more seasoned opposition, more experienced opposition, different styles of fighter, people who might look to wrestle her and put her on the back foot a little bit, something that maybe she hadn't experienced that much on the way up? Well, the answer was she'd do really well because she ran the table in the PFL Global Tournament and is now the PFL's world champion at 125 pounds. She's done incredibly. She's run the table. She's beaten almost everybody the PFL has to offer. With the possible exception of Liz Carmouche, there isn't really a lot there for her. And this is a problem now. She's an absolute star. She's grown her stardom through her performances on that PFL platform, through the European side, through the global side. And now she's at the point where she needs bigger fights. And I'm not sure the PFL have got them for her. And that's the problem. The Liz Carmouche fight, I think, is a fight that would be a really interesting one for a number of reasons. Like, number one, it's someone she hasn't fought yet. And Liz has been in there with a who's who of women's MMA over the course of her career. She's been a real ambassador for women's MMA. Let's not forget, she was the first female fighter to ever set foot in the octagon. The first one ever. She stepped in there to face Ronda Rousey. She was the blue corner, first one in the cage. And she wasn't that far off beating Ronda Rousey in that fight before she eventually got armbarred. And obviously we know everything that happened with Ronda since then, superstardom and all the rest of it. But Liz was super competitive in that fight. Since then, she's had a good run in the UFC. She then moved to Bellator, has become a champion in Bellator. And then when Bellator was absorbed by the PFL, she looked to become a champion in the PFL. Fell short in that quest in 2024. But there's definitely a super fight there. Liz Carmouche versus Dakota Ditcheva. If Dakota beats Liz Carmouche, what then? What then? I don't really know what's left in the PFL. Unless the PFL is suddenly going to sign a load of elite flyweights from the women's UFC roster, which is unlikely, then I don't really know what there is for Dakota. I'm not sure she'd want to move up to 135 pounds to try and do it at a higher weight class in the PFL. And even then, the depth of talent isn't there. So really, and I think the future for Dakota Ditcheva surely has to be in the UFC's women's flyweight division. You take a look at the fighters and the fights that are potentially there for her. There's probably 4 or 5 absolute dynamite matchups. But of course, the one that I think everyone would love to see, particularly now that Dakota is established herself as a champion, would be Dakota Ditcheva versus Valentina Shevchenko. There will be some people who hear this and say, that's far too early. She's not Valentina's level. Well, people have been saying that Dakota wasn't at the level to do what she's done so far. She's proved everybody wrong in terms of the doubters. Every single person that's doubted her, she's put their words straight back down their throat by winning, and winning well. She doesn't just scrape fights. She doesn't just eke decisions. She goes out there and demolishes people. And you don't often see that on that sort of consistent basis in women's MMA. I'd love to see, with all respect to the PFL, I don't think they've got much for Dakota Ditcheva. And Dakota in the women's flyweight division in the UFC would be a dynamite signing for the UFC, would open up so many great possibilities. Think about a fight with Alexa Grasso. Think about a fight with Jessica Andrade, Manon Fiorot. But it's that Valentina Shevchenko fight. I would love to see that. We might have to file this one under the less likely in terms of this list of things I'd love to see. But who wouldn't love to see Dakota Ditcheva in that UFC women's flyweight division? That would just be huge. Following in the footsteps of her American top teammate Kayla Harrison, who basically ran out of opposition in the PFL, moved across to the UFC, and is now chasing championship gold. I think that's the same path that Dakota needs to follow. My fear for her in 2025 is that we might only see her fight once, and that would be an absolute travesty given the trajectory that she's on. She needs fights, and she needs to be fighting the right kind of opposition. I just don't know if the PFL has it right now. So we'll see what happens. I have my fingers crossed that this is another big year for Dakota Ditcheva, who, let's not forget, the first ever female world champion in MMA for the UK, and someone who has rightfully been named the female fighter of the year by a lot of different outlets over the last month or so. She's been an absolute star, and she's proved a lot of people wrong. The question now is, what on earth did the PFL do with her in 2025? I'm very, very interested to see how this pans out. And if it ends up with Dakota joining the UFC later in the year, honestly, I think that would probably be the best thing for all concerned. Because if the PFL can't book her and can't matchmake her in fights that are going to keep people interested, it's not good for them either. It's not good for Dakota, and it's not good for them. So if they can work something where Dakota can head off, take the fights that she wants while the PFL builds their stars internally, then that might be the best way forward. But I have my fingers crossed it's another big year for Dakota. I just don't know whether those fights are there for her in the PFL. Let's see how it pans out. But for my list, Dakota Ditcheva in the UFC by the end of 2025. Okay, we're coming towards the end of my list of things I would love to see in mixed martial arts in 2025, and there is a rather large elephant in the room that has not been addressed yet. Let's just deal with it. Jon Jones, Tom Aspinall. This fight has to happen in 2025. If this fight does not happen in 2025, that only can be because Jon Jones opts to retire. There can't be any reason other than that for this fight not taking place. Jon Jones wants big money for this fight. You know what? He deserves big money for this fight. He's got everything to lose stepping into this. He's got his legacy of being basically an unbeaten fighter. He's fought a who's who. He's the heavyweight champion of the world. He's putting everything on the line against probably the most dangerous test of his entire career. Yes, he needs money. Also, this fight is up there and comparable with anything that heavyweight boxing can put on in terms of quality of matchup. Jones versus Aspinall is absolute top draw stuff in mixed martial arts. It would really galvanize the heavyweight division, and this fight is something that needs to happen. It just does. It needs to happen, and let's do it in a stadium, shall we? Let's do it in a stadium. This is a fight that is too big for the T-Mobile Arena. It is too big for the O2 Arena. This fight can only happen in one of two places, in my opinion. Number one, Wembley Stadium in London in the summer. We have seen huge heavyweight boxing matches at Wembley Stadium in the summer. Why not do the same for a Tom Aspinall title challenge against Jon Jones with 80,000 people at Wembley Stadium? I know Dana White is not a huge fan of stadium shows, and this is by no means opening the door to every other title fight being a stadium show. When it's that big, when the occasion is that huge, and the occasion demands something bigger than an 18,000 seat arena or a 20,000 seat arena, you have to go to a stadium. And TKO, the parent company of the UFC, are used to playing stadiums. Look at what the WWE do on the regular basis. All of their big PLE events are these days in massive stadiums, huge stadiums. You know, the big NFL stadiums. You know, Lincoln Financial Field played host to WrestleMania not that long ago, I think. MetLife Stadium is going to play host to a huge PLE soon as well. We've got these huge stadium events are being held by TKO under the WWE banner and have been for years. Let's not deprive mixed martial arts fans that same experience, that same scale of show, but it has to be the right fight. You can't just put any title fight at the top of a stadium card and say, come one, come all, here's a big event. It needs to be a big enough fight. And this fight absolutely does that. Jon Jones, Tom Aspinall is as big of a fight that the UFC could book. Full stop. I don't think there's a bigger fight you could book in any weight class than that fight. Get it in a stadium. If not Wembley, Allegiant Stadium. It's in the UFC's backyard. The weather is far more reliable than it is in London. And if you're Jon Jones, to be completely honest, you wouldn't really want to concede that sort of home field advantage to the challenger, because 80,000 fans at Wembley Stadium is going to be very different to 80,000 fans in Las Vegas. The crowd will be much more evenly split, I would suggest, in Vegas. If the fight takes place in London, it's going to be Aspinall City, and Jones will very much know that he is the B-side in terms of the fan interest in the building that night. So I think Vegas is the place to hold it. I think T-Mobile Arena is too small. It has to be Allegiant Stadium. Get it in Allegiant Stadium and host something special. And they've done the Sphere. Now let's do Allegiant Stadium. I think it would be the right fight for Jon Jones to sort of draw a line under his MMA career, if he indeed wanted to stop it there, more of which in a minute. But if this was going to be his last fight, what a way to do it. A title defense against the most dangerous opponent of his career, in a huge stadium. And for Tom Aspinall, you've worked your way up, you've beaten everybody you've needed to fight. And now you're up there. You're not just fighting for the title, you're not just fighting a champion, you're fighting the greatest of all time. If you're going to fight the greatest of all time for the biggest prize in the sport, why not do it on the biggest stage possible? The fight capital of the world, Las Vegas, in the biggest possible building that they could put it in Sin City, Allegiant Stadium, the Death Star. Let's just have this. Have this one. Come on, Dana, we can do this. We can do this. The Death Star, Allegiant Stadium, 80,000 fans, Jon Jones, Tom Aspinall. Load up that fight card, International Fight Week, and let's blow the roof off the place with the biggest heavyweight fight in UFC history. Let's see it. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we got one more. And I've kind of done this in some sort of order, kind of gradually ranking these things ever bigger as we go along. Jones versus Aspinall, how could he get bigger than that? There's one more thing that I wanted to add to this, because Jon Jones versus Tom Aspinall in a stadium is like endgame type stuff, right? This is surely you can't do much bigger than that. There's one more thing that we could do, and it's the truth that doesn't often speak its name, which is a co-promoted event, a co-promoted fight. And I said that Jones versus Aspinall was just about the biggest fight the UFC could do. Between two contracted UFC fighters, I think that is true. There is a bigger fight out there. And that fight is Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou. And this is completely removed from whatever might happen with Jones and Aspinall. I think Jones versus Ngannou is a fight that could follow Jones versus Aspinall, regardless of what happens in that fight. If Jones beats Tom Aspinall, then obviously it's champion versus champion. It's the UFC champion against the former UFC champion who never lost his belt. Everything aligns perfectly. And if that was going to be Jon Jones's final fight, then that would be perfect. Absolutely spot on. If Tom Aspinall was to dethrone Jon Jones, that fight is still relevant for Jon Jones to go in there and fight Francis Ngannou, because it's the fight the world has always wanted to see. And it's still the greatest of all time versus the heavyweight champion who never lost his belt. And it's a fight that has been talked about for so long. There is enough money in the world, there is enough money in the combat sports world that this fight could happen. The only thing preventing it from happening is decision makers who maybe want to protect their brand and things like this. But I think that's diminished. I understand why Dana White would not want to expose his world champion or the greatest ever to a fight that potentially he might lose, and that might take some of the luster off him, and by association could be viewed as damaging his own product. understand it, but I don't agree with it. Here's why. If this is Jon Jones's retirement fight, then does it matter whether he wins or loses? Obviously, it does to Jon, but does it matter to the UFC? If Jon Jones has already been beaten by Tom Aspinall, does it matter if Jon Jones wins or loses against Francis Ngannou? I don't think it does. So what it is one final huge event that the UFC can be a part of. The only difference with this one is they wouldn't have the entirety of the pie. They'd be splitting the pie or sharing the pie with Ngannou's side of the deal with the PFL. And I know co-promoting is not something that the UFC feels any need to do. They certainly don't have any financial need to do it. And the argument might be that it gives the PFL more kudos and more strength by doing so. But if the UFC are that confident in their standing as the head and shoulders number one, far and away the industry leader in this sport, then I don't think it matters. I think it's just one fight, because if you're both involved in it, you're both involved in it. No one promotion's going to get that much of a bump over the other one. You know, if your guy loses, but it's his last fight, what does it matter? If your guy loses and he's already been beaten by another one of your guys, and Tom Aspinall's the undisputed champion, what does it matter? It's just a huge fight. It's a huge fight. And the UFC ultimately have made themselves as big as they are, as massive as they are, by giving the world the fights people want to see. And in terms of Jones versus Aspinall, and in terms of Jones versus Ngannou, I don't think there are two bigger fights that the UFC could give to the world in 2025. I would love to see it. And once they've done it, there's no problem after that. They don't have to worry about that anymore. And, you know, Brock Lesnar versus Fedor, we never saw it. Randy Couture versus Fedor, we never saw it. Anderson Silva versus Georges St. Pierre, we never saw it. These are legendary matchups that have become huge what-ifs in MMA folklore. Let's not let Jones versus Aspinall become one of those. Let's not let Jones versus Ngannou become one of those. Let's make them happen. Let's put them in the history books as two of the biggest fights in the history of the sport. And I think Jones would be up for both of those. And I think that they would be a fitting end to an incredible career for Johnny Bones. And he can walk off into the sunset having claimed the biggest bag possible on his way out the door, and having fought in the two biggest fights he could possibly have put on just before he calls time on his career. I'd love to see it. It's unlikely, I know. I know it's unlikely. But you've got to wish for some of these things, and some of the things on this list are quite realistic. And some of the things on my list, a little bit more far-fetched. And maybe this is the one that you just wish that something could happen so that Jones versus Ngannou fight could potentially happen. Let's cross our fingers and hope that something crazy happens in 2025 and we get to see Jones versus Aspinall in the summer. And then we get to see, regardless of that result, Jones versus Ngannou on New Year's Eve, let's say. What a way to finish 2025 that would be. Jon Jones, Francis Ngannou on New Year's Eve. And that's just about all we got time for on the RDX Sports podcast for our very first show in 2025. A few realistic options for the coming year. A few somewhat ambitious ones, but let's see how many of those we get to see over the course of the next 12 months. 2025 promises to be another big year for combat sports. And wouldn't it be great if all those items on that list ended up being checked off by the time we get round to the 2025 review episode in a year's time? It should be a big year for the sport, and I'm really looking forward to what's coming up. And I'm really looking forward to sharing that with you over the course of the next 12 months as we preview and review the big events of the year as we talk about the big stories of the year and maybe share some insight from some of the names involved in those stories over the course of the coming 12 months, all right here on the RDX Sports Podcast. Please do hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Make sure that every time we drop a new episode, you know about it and you can check out the episodes right here on the RDX Sports YouTube channel. If you'd like to get the audio version of this podcast, you are more than welcome to do so. It is going to be available to you on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So search for the RDX Sports Podcast on both of those platforms and hit that subscribe button over there or the follow button on Spotify to make sure that you get the latest episodes there so you can listen on the move as well. Follow me on the socials. I'm at Simon Head Sport across all social platforms. And don't forget, of course, to follow RDX Sports across all the different channels as well. Check out the latest news and coverage from RDX Sports at blogs.rdxsports.com. And all that remains for me is to say, enjoy the fights. The UFC are back in circulation this weekend with their first fight night event of the year. The following week, we'll see the first pay-per-view event of 2025, UFC 311 from Los Angeles. The Intuit Dome will be playing host to that event. Islam Makhachev versus Arman Tsarukyan in the main event. We'll preview that on next week's show. Until then, enjoy the fights this weekend, and I'll speak to you in a week's time.